Hi everyone, we're back. I'm going to give you a review of what we talked about the last time I appeared online. At the last time I appeared online, we were talking about a framework for responding to ethical dilemmas that you might face at work. And just a reminder, an ethical dilemma will be a situation in which you feel uncomfortable. There's a tension between your values and your company's values, and you have to figure out what to do. So the last time we met online, I talked about a framework that includes starting out with what are the facts, find out as many facts as possible. Then I asked you to be able to articulate an issue. So the issue should start with the word should. Should I or should my company? And then I encouraged you to think of options. So there might be some options, some things you can do to respond to the ethical dilemma. And now we're at the part that's the core of what we're going to talk about, which is what principles should guide your behavior. And hang on, because I'm going to give you an overview of the principles, and then I'm going to go through a couple of examples so that when you're faced with a question, you can remember what I said should be going through your mind so that you can have a good response to an ethical dilemma. And also remember that ethics means that other people count. This isn't about maximizing your interests. It's about remembering that there are other people whose interests count, maybe consumers or other stakeholders. So the principles that could guide your behavior. Oh, here they are. If you had ethics as an undergraduate student, you're going to recognize these. And my apologies if you happen to be a philosophy professor and you're watching this, because I'm going to get right to the taglines. There's ethical theorists are very smart, they're very complicated, and so just remember that there's a whole field of philosophy behind these principles. The first one is utilitarian thought. That principle says that you should do that which leads to the best consequences for everyone involved. Here's the tagline: the greatest good for the greatest number. This principle should feel a little bit comfortable or natural for you, because utilitarian thought is something that underlies a lot of business decision making anyway. So we weigh the pros and the cons. So utilitarians are going to make a decision that maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number. That's one principle that can guide our behavior. The second principle is the principle of duty. We should do that which you are motivated to do for the sake of duty. And how do we know what our duty is? Our duty is to follow the moral law. How do we know what that is? Well, most of us know at some level what our moral duty is by reflecting back to lessons we learned from our parents or in church, our religious principles. So we'll follow our duty, which is a duty to follow the moral law. So hang on, because I'll give you an example in a few minutes. Our third principle is virtue. Virtue is different from the other two principles. With utilitarian thought and the principle of duty, we're answering the question, what should I do in this moment? With the principle of virtue, the question is bigger. We're asking, what kind of person must I become so that I know what the right thing is? It's more about character development. So virtue says, do that which is consistent with the type of person I wish to become. So these are three principles. When you're faced with an ethical dilemma, you don't have to just pick one. You can go through each principle and see what the principle might do to guide your behavior. Let's start with an example that's kind of out there, and that is the case of conjoined twins. Sorry, philosophers, but I want to let you know, audience, that philosophers often go into the realm of talking about something that hardly ever happens. And I feel comfortable talking about conjoined twins because twins are hardly ever conjoined. Twins are conjoined in approximately 1 out of every 200,000 births. So we'll talk in a little bit of a lighthearted way about conjoined twins, which is why I've indicated that there's a cartoon. All right. So let me set the stage for this unrealistic scenario that's going to allow us to go through our three principles, which are utilitarian principles, duty principles, and virtue principles. So let's take a case of conjoined twins, and they were just born. So it complicates things if the conjoined twins are now grown up and they can speak. Let's keep them really tiny, and it's just the parents and the doctor, and you are the doctor. You have conjoined twins, and we'll set the scenario such that the conjoined twins share organs, but one of the twins is much stronger than the other. We'll also set a parameter where neither twin will live if they remain conjoined. But if you separate the twins, the stronger twin will live and the weaker twin will die. So let's go through our principles. Let's think about those conjoined twins from the perspective of utilitarian thought. We're going to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, which means you're the doctor and you're saying to yourself, what's the best we can do here? We can't save both twins. We already know that. But if we let one twin die, we can save one twin. So to a utilitarian thinker, you would separate the twins because that would maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. You'd end up with one surviving twin. Now, let's move on to a principle that says, let's look at the situation from the perspective of duty. And what is our moral duty? So if you were a doctor, you know that you go through the utilitarian thought and you're going to say, I'm going to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. I can save one twin. If you look at the moral duty, that one gets really complicated. In fact, they're all complicated. But just to give you a sense of the thought process, you'd say, I have a duty to follow the moral law. And the moral law says, I cannot make a decision that will take a life. If I make a decision to separate the twins, I'm making a decision to take a life. And my moral duty is to refrain from taking a life. So I'm going to refrain from separating the twins and let nature take its course, and I will not be a person who made the decision to take a life. That would be following your sense of moral duty. As I said before, the principle of virtue is different because the principle of virtue is not asking, what should I do in this situation? The principle of virtue is asking, how can I become the kind of person who will do the right thing in a given moment? And virtue theory is complicated. But I'm a doctor, and as a doctor, I will have become a morally mature person. So the theory of virtue says, let's become the kind of person who will know what to do. And virtue is a theory where we would follow habits, and those habits would be discipline, courage, fairness, and we would operate in a middle ground. If we look at courage, for example, we have to be brave, but we can't be foolhardy. We can't be timid on the one end, and we can't be foolhardy on the other. We need to have a moderate amount of courage. So in the situation of the conjoined twins, we would ask, what would a mature, moderate thinking doctor do? What would you do? And probably most doctors would decide to save the life of the one twin. That would be a moderate, it's nothing in the extreme. We want to take a middle ground. We're going to have a habit of being moderate. So that was a situation that wasn't related to business. Now let's move on to a situation that does involve a business decision. I'm going to give you a few moments to read this cartoon. So for those of you who've been following the news, the cartoon you've just taken a look at is an actual real case. And the case I'm going to talk with you about today is the case of General Motors, GM. knowing that the company had a problem with their ignition switch and choosing not to do anything about it until several customers had been in accidents and had died, and a lot of individuals were injured. So this is the case of withheld information. I'm going to back all the way up to our first session, and I'm going to talk with you a little bit, just very briefly, a recap of steps you might want to go through. So let's talk about the scenario of General Motors. If you're not familiar with the case, what happened is that General Motors designed an ignition process that worked most of the time, but sometimes did not work. So when you put your key into the ignition and started your car and you went down the road you were driving, there were times that the ignition turned off. And the ignition turned off for a couple reasons. Sometimes individuals had a key ring that was too heavy, so the key ring itself pushed the ignition out of the on position and onto the off or auxiliary position. And technically, the reason that happened was that there was a design flaw in the ignition mechanism itself. What ended up happening was that at times when a person was driving, the car turned off. And that meant that a person was driving and the car lost power, which meant that if the person lost control of the car and hit a tree or left the right lane and went into another lane and got hit by an oncoming car, airbags didn't deploy. The person could not control the car because the power steering had stopped, and there were fatalities and there were injuries. So in terms of the case of withheld information, we're going to go back to around 2007 when engineers at General Motors for sure had information that the problem was at least in part due to a defective part of the car. And those engineers chose to withhold that information. They didn't tell the federal government. They did not tell their customers, although General Motors did notify car dealers and urged car dealers to do something for customers who came in to complain about their cars. So let's go back. What are the facts? So I've given you such a brief recap. The first thing you're going to want to do is find out as much as possible. And the good news is that today you can look on the internet and you can find all kinds of information about what General Motors knew, when General Motors knew, who knew, how high up was the information shared. So what are the facts? And then you ask, what are the issues? So here the question is, let's suppose that you are an engineer and you are the one who discovers that the company knows there's a problem with the car, but consumers are unlikely to know there's a problem with the car. So the question is, should I take steps so that individuals in decision-making positions within General Motors know what is going wrong with the car and what the consequences are for people driving the cars? So should I, instead of withholding information, should I share information with the hopes of creating positive change? And then we get to the question, what are the options? What can I do? So there are usually more options than two. There are usually more options other than, should I withhold information or should I share information? For example, for most of you in an organization, there's another option. Should I share the information with someone I trust? Do I have a mentor within the company? Can I run the scenario by somebody who's been helpful to me in the past, somebody I trust? So what are the options? So what are the facts? What are the issues? What are the options? And then we're going to get to our principles. So as a review, our principles are utilitarian thought, duty-based thinking, and virtue ethics. So let's start with utilitarian thought. Remember, our tagline is, we're going to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. So what should we do? this scenario in the cartoon reminds us that sometimes our calculations about what to do in a given situation are incorrect. General Motors made a mistake. Somebody at General Motors probably did calculate how can I maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, but the calculation was wrong. So if you're in a situation and you're trying to figure out what to do and you're engaging in utilitarian thought, sometimes we start to forget that we're not maximizing our self-interest, but instead we're supposed to be maximizing the greatest good for all of our stakeholders. So there was a specific engineer at General Motors who ended up even lying in depositions about what he knew and when he knew it. And you can find that information out if you want by looking at the legal complaint in some of the General Motors cases. Look at the Melton, M-E-L-T-O-N case, for example. So if you have this information and you're maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number, for sure you're going to share the information, because to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, you're going to want to do everything you can to prevent deaths and to prevent injuries and to prevent General Motors from being sued over those deaths and injuries. Don't just ask yourself what will be best for my career. It's going to look bad for me if I blow the whistle on other engineers who might know what's going on in this scenario. So utilitarian thought, maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. The second principle that we're going to go through is the principle of duty. We're going to ask, what is my duty here? And my duty is to follow the moral law. So go back to your moral gut, to what your parents taught you, to what you learned in your religious training. What is your moral duty? And here, your moral duty is to take care of others and to do your best to try to prevent harm to others. So in that scenario, you're not going to withhold information. You're going to share information, and you're going to share information in an effective way so that the word can get out about how to fix the car and how to make sure that everybody who's driving your car remains safe. So here we have our two principles, utilitarian thought and a duty-based thought. And both of them, when you go in your mind, you're going to be affirmed, because you're going to say, these two very different principles lead me to the same place, which is I should share the information I have. All right, so now we're at our third principle, which is virtue theory. And that theory asks us, what kind of person must I become so that in this moment I know what the right thing to do is? So virtue is something that's practiced, and virtue means developing good habits, good moral habits. And those moral habits ask you to be moderate. They ask you to have a moderate amount of courage, discipline, a sense of fairness, a sense of wisdom, a sense of doing what's right, not operating in the extremes. So here, you could operate in the extremes. You could be foolhardy. You could say, I'm not going to talk to anybody within my company. I'm just going to call the New York Times and get this information out to a reporter. Well, that might be a little bit foolhardy, because there might be things you don't know. There might be steps that have already been taken. There might be a rollout of the best information that's going to happen tomorrow, and you just don't know it. So virtue theory would ask you to operate in a middle ground, to be cautious, but to take action. So in the case of withheld information, utilitarian thought and a duty-based ethical principle and virtue theory are all going to lead you to the same outcome, which is consumers need to know, and the company needs to be the one to step up to the plate and let everybody know the right information in a timely way. In the situation with General Motors, from the mid-2000s to around 2014, the company was not forthcoming. But this story has a positive end, because when a new CEO took the helm at General Motors, one of the first things the new CEO did was that she took responsibility and she made sure that everybody, government agencies, consumers, the public, all had all the information that General Motors had. And so now this ethical dilemma has been resolved. There's still fallout from the legal system because General Motors miscalculated what would maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And so, regrettably, the legal system has stepped in, and now there's a class action lawsuit against General Motors, and people who were hurt or whose relatives were killed now have to seek an apology through money through the court system. And if engineers at General Motors had been following a good framework for ethical decision making, the outcome would have been different.